There is a document sitting in the National Archives in Washington that most Americans will never read. It runs to thousands of pages, cross-referenced across county militia rolls, pension files, bounty land warrants, and regimental muster lists. It records the names of the men who signed their lives to a war that was, by any honest measure, not supposed to be won. Many of those names are common enough that you have passed them on street signs without a second thought. Some of them are sitting in your own family tree right now, attached to an ancestor you may know almost nothing about. And a handful of them carry a story that the official record alone cannot contain, a story that the DNA and the county archives and the migration patterns have only recently begun to tell in full. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Revolutionary War pension files, first processed under the Act of 1818 and then expanded under the Act of 1832, represent one of the largest genealogical deposits in American history. A soldier who applied for a pension had to prove his service, which meant sworn testimony, corroborating witnesses, discharge papers where they survived, and in many cases a detailed account of his movements through the war years. What came out of that process was not just a military record. It was a window into who these men were, where they came from, what they owned, who their neighbors were, and what they were carrying before the war began. 20 surnames appear in those files with a frequency and a geographic spread that points to something larger than coincidence. 20 names that moved through the war and out the other side into the American interior, each one trailing a genealogical record that still has gaps in it, gaps that the DNA has only started to fill. The pension files are held today at the National Archives in two primary series. The Revolutionary War pension and bounty land warrant applications recorded in microfilm publication M804 contain over 80,000 individual case files. The records vary enormously in their completeness. Some men filed applications late in life, decades after the war, and their testimony is the richest genealogical material that period produced, because the pension examiners required them to narrate their service in detail and to identify corroborating witnesses who could confirm what they claimed. Other files contain only a fragment, a name, and a regiment designation on a discharge paper that was itself a copy, the original having been destroyed or lost in the decades between the war and the application. Between those two extremes sits most of the record, partial but navigable, detailed enough to place a man in a place and time, but silent on the questions a genealogist most wants answered. One detail about those files matters before you go looking at your own surname in them. The Pension Act of 1832 was the first to require narrative testimony, and many of the men who filed under it were old, some of them well into their 70s and 80s, testifying before county court justices about service that had ended 50 years earlier. What they remembered, and what they chose to say, and what the court recorder chose to write down are three different things. The pension testimony is not a verbatim transcript. It is a summary produced by a clerk who was trying to capture the relevant military facts. The personal details that leak through, the named neighbors, the described terrain, the offhand references to family members who could corroborate the timeline, are there because the examiner needed them for the claim, not because anyone intended to create a genealogical record. That accidental quality is exactly what makes the files so useful and so strange to read today. The first name on that list is Miller. In the census of 1790, Miller ranked among the top 10 surnames in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and the pension files from those states carry it by the hundreds. The Miller men who served were not a unified community. They were German immigrants who had anglicized Mueller, Scots-Irish settlers from the Cumberland Valley, and English families who had carried the name across the Atlantic 2 generations before. What the DNA shows, when you test men named Miller across those 3 founding populations, is exactly what you would expect from a name with multiple independent origins. The Y-chromosome signature fractures across at least 3 haplogroup clusters, with R1b dominant among the British origin lines, I1 appearing in the German origin cluster, and a secondary R1a signal in the eastern Pennsylvania records, consistent with Central European migration. There is no single Miller ancestor in the Revolutionary records. There are dozens, each line traceable to a different migration corridor and a different genetic type. The name alone tells you almost nothing. The paper trail and the Y chromosome together tell you which Miller you actually are, and the pension file, if it survives for your ancestor, can place him in a regiment, a county, and a specific year with a precision that most colonial-era records cannot reach. Sullivan is a different case entirely. The Sullivan men who appear in the Revolutionary War records were predominantly Irish in origin, drawn from the wave of Munster and Ulster migration that had been moving through Pennsylvania and Virginia since the 1720s. General John Sullivan of New Hampshire, who led the Continental Army's campaign against the Iroquois Confederacy in 1779, gave the name a prominence it had not previously held in American military history. The Sullivan Campaign, which systematically destroyed dozens of Haudenosaunee towns across western New York and Pennsylvania in the summer and fall of 1779, is recorded in the journals of officers who served under him with a geographic precision that genealogists have used to trace the movements of individual soldiers through the campaign. The pension files for men named Sullivan cluster heavily in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, with a secondary concentration in the Carolinas that corresponds to the Scots-Irish migration down the Great Wagon Road. The Y-chromosome data for Sullivan, drawn from surname projects, shows a strong haplogroup R1b signal consistent with Irish origin, but with notable exceptions in the Carolinas cluster, where haplogroup I1 appears at a rate that suggests a surname adoption event at some point in the colonial period. A man who took the name Sullivan without carrying the Irish bloodline it was supposed to represent. Thompson carries its own complications. The name is a Scottish and Northern English patronymic, son of Thomas, and in the pension files it appears across every state, in every regiment type, from the Continental line to the state militias to the irregular companies that never had a formal commission at all. The Thompson men of western Pennsylvania and the Virginia backcountry were often Scots-Irish, and the surname distribution maps show a migration path that follows the Scots-Irish settlement corridor with unusual fidelity, down through the Shenandoah Valley, across the Cumberland Gap, and into the Kentucky and Tennessee country, where the name remains common today. A Thompson Y-chromosome project run through Family Tree DNA has identified at least 4 distinct haplogroup clusters within the surname, confirming what the paper trail already suggested. This is a name with multiple founding lines, some of them with no documented connection to one another at all. A Thompson with deep Cumberland County, Pennsylvania roots has a different ancestral story than a Thompson from Rowan County, North Carolina, and the DNA reflects that difference with a clarity the pension files alone cannot produce. Anderson, Jackson, and Harris each appear in the pension files with a regularity that reflects their status as common surnames across multiple ethnic communities. Anderson is Scandinavian in origin but had been thoroughly absorbed into the Scots-Irish naming pattern by the time of the Revolution, and the pension files carry it heaviest in the Mid-Atlantic and Virginia Piedmont. Jackson appears less frequently in the Revolutionary pension files than the name's later prominence might suggest, a reminder that Andrew Jackson himself was born in 1767 and was too young for most of the war's major actions, though the old Waxhaws region of the Carolinas where he grew up contributed heavily to the militia roles under other surnames, including several of the names on this list. Harris is an English patronymic, son of Harry, and the pension files show it distributed across Virginia and the Carolinas in a pattern consistent with the English settler migration from the Tidewater interior, westward through the Piedmont counties, and then over the Blue Ridge into the valley. Martin and Moore are worth pausing on, because they appear in the pension files in concentrations that map almost exactly onto the Scots-Irish settlement pattern in the Carolina backcountry. The Battle of Kings Mountain in October of 1780, the engagement that historians often cite as the turning point of the Southern campaign, was fought largely by frontier militia from the Overmountain settlements of what is now eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. These were men who lived beyond the mountains, in settlements that the British command had dismissed as too remote to be militarily relevant. They proved that assessment wrong in a single afternoon on a ridgeline in York County, South Carolina. The muster lists for that engagement carry Martin and Moore with enough frequency that a genealogist working on either surname and finding a Carolina or Tennessee line in the early national period has a reasonable basis for placing that ancestor within 50 miles of Kings Mountain. The pension testimony of Martin men who fought there describes a landscape of ridgeline trails and creek fords that the present-day Appalachian terrain still matches almost exactly. Several Martin pension applicants from that region describe neighbors by name who appear in adjacent files, creating a web of corroborating testimony that genealogists have used to reconstruct entire communities whose church and county records were destroyed during the war itself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Wilson and White each carry a particular interest in the context of Revolutionary War genealogy because both names were adopted, in documented cases, by families whose original identity the official record did not permit them to maintain. Wilson, a Scottish and Scots-Irish patronymic meaning son of Will, appears in the pension files for Virginia and the Carolinas at a rate that reflects the heavy Scots-Irish presence in those militia rolls. But the surname also appears in records of free black families in the post-war period, adopted by men who had served in integrated Continental Line regiments and who took English surnames after the war as a matter of social necessity or personal choice. The Continental Army, particularly in its New England and Mid-Atlantic formations, included black soldiers in numbers that the popular memory of the Revolution has consistently underrepresented. Estimates drawn from pension file physical descriptions and from the records of regiments known to have accepted black enlistees suggest that several thousand black men served in the Continental Army over the course of the war, many of them in integrated units alongside white soldiers from the same counties. A pension file for a man named Wilson who served from Connecticut or Rhode Island and who is described in the physical description column of his discharge papers as a man of color represents a genealogical thread that the DNA has sometimes followed farther than the paper could. The Y-chromosome data documented in Wilson's surname projects shows R1b signals consistent with British origin alongside E1b1a signals that trace to West African descent, carried today by men whose paper trail ends, in most cases, at the generation immediately after the Revolution. White presents a related question from a different angle. The name White was used in documented instances during the late 18th and early 19th centuries by families of mixed Native American and European descent who were in the process of a racial reclassification that the census records reflect but do not explain. A family recorded as white in the 1790 census might carry Cherokee, Catawba, or Powhatan ancestry that the naming convention was specifically designed to obscure. The pension files for men named White, who served from Virginia and the Carolinas, include a subset of applications where the testimony describes physical characteristics, community associations, and land holdings in boundary zones between white settlement and native territory that genealogists familiar with Native American history in the region have identified as potentially marking mixed heritage lines. The pension examiners who recorded this testimony were not performing genealogical analysis. They were processing military claims. The result is that the files contain details, a description of a man's appearance, a reference to land located at a boundary line, a neighbor named with a surname that appears in Cherokee census records, that carry genealogical weight the examiners never intended to deposit. The DNA has sometimes confirmed what the paper implied, returning haplogroup Q signals associated with Native American male lineages in white surname lines from the Carolina and Virginia Piedmont that the official record classified as white from the 1780s onward. Taylor, like Miller, is an occupational name with multiple independent origins, and the pension files carry it across every region. The Taylor men who appear most frequently in the Mid-Atlantic files were English in origin, while the Carolina and Virginia Piedmont records show a Scots-Irish concentration consistent with the settlement patterns of that community. There is a subset of Taylor pension applications from Western Virginia and Kentucky, however, that describe service in irregular units operating in territory that by the 1780s was the active boundary zone between American settlement and Cherokee country. The men named Taylor who served in those units were not simply soldiers in a formal military sense. They were participants in a land contest whose outcome would determine whether the families already present in those valleys, some of them of mixed Cherokee and European descent, could remain on land they had held for generations. The pension files record the soldiers' perspective on that contest with the matter-of-fact authority of men who considered the outcome settled. The Cherokee records, where they survive in documents that predate the removals of the 1830s, record a different perspective on the same events, and they sometimes include the names of mixed heritage families that also appear, under slightly different spellings, in the Revolutionary pension files. Davis is Welsh in origin, a patronymic meaning son of David, and the Welsh migration to Pennsylvania and Virginia in the colonial period was substantial enough to give the name a regional character in the Mid-Atlantic that it retains today. By the time of the Revolution, Davis had become common enough across multiple communities that it was already beginning to lose its specifically Welsh character in the southern colonies, absorbed into a broader English-speaking settler culture that did not always preserve the ethnic distinctions of the first generation. A Davis family in Chester County in 1760 was likely Welsh Baptist. A Davis family in Rowan County, North Carolina in the same year might be Welsh, or might be English, or might be the product of an intermarriage between those communities that the church register recorded without comment. The Revolutionary War pension files for Pennsylvania show Davis with a concentration in the Welsh settled counties of Chester, Montgomery, and Lancaster that is statistically distinct from the surname's distribution in Virginia or the Carolinas. A Davis family from Chester County in 1790 has a measurably different genealogical and genetic profile than a Davis family from Rowan County, North Carolina, in the same year. The Y-chromosome data from Davis surname projects reflects that difference, with haplogroup R1b subclade L21 strongly associated with Welsh and broader Celtic origin populations, appearing at elevated rates in the Pennsylvania cluster relative to the Carolina sample. The pension testimony from Pennsylvania Davis families sometimes references Welsh language Baptist congregations and land transactions with Welsh language annotations, details that the haplogroup data now connects to a demographic movement that began in Wales 2 generations before the Revolution, and that deposited communities of Welsh speakers in the Pennsylvania counties before the name spread south into mixed populations, where the Welsh character of the line was gradually absorbed into a broader Scots-Irish and English cultural environment. Roberts is another Welsh patronymic, and the pension files carry it with a heavy concentration in Pennsylvania and the Virginia Valley, consistent with the Welsh Quaker and Welsh Baptist migrations of the early 18th century. The Roberts men who served in the Continental Line from Pennsylvania were often members of established Welsh-descended communities, with documented church affiliations, land records, and probate files that make the genealogical reconstruction relatively straightforward for lines that have been researched. The Roberts men who served from the Carolina backcountry present a more complicated picture, because the name had been carried into that region by multiple migration streams with different origins, including English families who had no Welsh connection at all, and the pension testimony alone does not always distinguish between them. The Y chromosome, in those cases, does the work the document cannot do. A Roberts man from Chester County, Pennsylvania, whose pension file references a Welsh Baptist congregation and a land boundary described in Welsh-inflected English, is likely carrying the L21 haplogroup that traces to the Welsh migration. A Roberts man from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, whose pension testimony places him in the same Scots-Irish militia network as his Moore and Martin neighbors, is likely carrying a different Y signature entirely, one that connects to the border country migration rather than to the Welsh settlements. Thomas is a given name used as a surname, and its concentration in the pension files from Virginia and Kentucky reflects the naming patterns of Welsh-descended and English families who had been in America for 2 or 3 generations by the time of the Revolution. The Thomas men who appear in the Kentucky pension files were often veterans of Dunmore's War in 1774, the conflict that preceded the Revolution in the Ohio Valley frontier, and that drew heavily on the same Virginia backcountry families who would later form the core of the state militia. A Thomas ancestor with a Kentucky land warrant dated to the 1780s has a plausible genealogical path back through the Virginia Piedmont to an English or Welsh colonial settler, and the DNA evidence from Thomas surname projects confirms the predominantly British haplogroup signal in that migration corridor. Where the line breaks, where the haplogroup does not match the expected British signal, the reasons are usually traceable to the same forces that affected Wilson and White, the adoption of an English surname by a family whose actual origin the record was not designed to preserve. Clark and Lewis each carry a particular resonance in the context of Revolutionary War genealogy because of the men who made those names famous in the decades immediately after the war. George Rogers Clark, who conducted the Illinois Campaign of 1778 and 1779 that secured the Old Northwest for the United States, came from a Virginia family whose pension and land record trail extends back to the colonial Tidewater in Caroline County, Virginia. His younger brother William, who would later accompany Meriwether Lewis across the continent, was born at the family plantation in Caroline County in 1770. The Clark pension files from Virginia show the name distributed across the Piedmont and Valley in a pattern consistent with the English settler migration from the Tidewater interior, with a secondary concentration in Kentucky that reflects the post-war movement of Virginia families across the mountains in the 1780s and 90s. Lewis appears in the pension files from Virginia and Pennsylvania with a frequency that reflects both the Welsh migration, Lewis being among the most common Welsh surnames in British America, and the English settler presence in those colonies. The Y-chromosome data for Lewis shows a haplogroup distribution that mirrors that dual origin, with R1b-L21 elevated in the Pennsylvania sample, and a more diverse subclade picture in the Virginia records that points to the broader range of origins that fed into the Tidewater settler population. Scott and Young round out the 20 surnames with a genealogical character that is in each case specific to the communities that carried them. Scott is a border name, common among the families who came from the English and Scottish border country, the old Reaver territory, that fed the Scots-Irish migration to Ulster and then to Pennsylvania and the Carolina backcountry in the 1700s. The Scott men in the Revolutionary pension files from the Carolinas and Virginia are concentrated in exactly the counties where Scots-Irish settlement was densest, and the Y-chromosome data from Scott surname projects shows haplogroup I1 and R1b signals consistent with that origin population in proportions that track the known demographic makeup of the border migration. Young is an English descriptive surname, given originally to the younger of two men with the same given name in a community, and the pension files carry it across the mid-Atlantic and South in a distribution that reflects English settler presence rather than any single ethnic migration corridor. The young men in the Kentucky pension files include several applicants whose testimony describes service in the same Overmountain campaigns that produced the Martin and Moore pension cluster, suggesting a community of neighbors who served together and then moved together into the post-war Western settlements, carrying their surnames and their Y chromosomes in parallel down the same migration corridors. What the pension files show, when you read across all 20 names, is that the Revolutionary War was not fought by a single American people. It was fought by English colonists and Scots-Irish settlers and Welsh immigrants and German families who had anglicized their names and free black men who took English surnames after the war, and men of mixed Native American descent who presented themselves in the census as white because the alternative was dispossession from land they had cleared and farmed. The war's record preserved some of those identities and erased others with equal thoroughness. The pension examiners who took down the testimony were interested in military service, not in ancestry. The census takers who followed them were interested in racial classification, not in family history. Between those two official silences, the actual genealogical record of who these men were and where they came from has had to be reconstructed from the gaps in the documents, from the migration patterns that do not match the claimed origins, and from the DNA that carries what neither the pension file nor the census was designed to hold. The process of reading those gaps is not straightforward, and any researcher who tells you otherwise is oversimplifying what the record actually contains. A haplogroup result is not a conclusion. It is a direction pointing toward a population origin that the paper trail may or may not confirm. A pension file is not a complete biography. It is a legal document produced under specific administrative pressures, in which a man said what he needed to say to receive what he was owed. The genealogical work happens in the space between those two imperfect sources, where a migration pattern corroborates a haplogroup, where a named neighbor in the pension testimony appears in a church register with a different surname than the one he was later recorded under, where a land warrant places a family at a boundary line they had every reason to be near. That is where the record gets honest, not in the documents themselves, but in what they point toward when you read them together. There is a pension file in the National Archives, filed under the Act of 1832, from a man who gave his name as James Moore and his place of service as the South Carolina militia, in the district that by the time of his application had become York County. He testified to having served at the Siege of 96 in 1781 and at several engagements in the Carolina backcountry that the pension examiners were able to corroborate through other testimony. What the file does not contain, and what no county record from his period appears to supply, is any documentation of where James Moore was born, where his parents came from, or what community he belonged to before the war. The pension examiner noted that the applicant appeared to be, in the examiner's language, a man of mixed blood, but the application was approved on the basis of the military testimony, and James Moore received his pension. His descendants appear in the 1820 census as white, in a Carolina county where families of mixed Scots-Irish, Cherokee, and African descent had been settling since the 1750s. The DNA of men who carry the Moore surname from that county today returns a haplogroup distribution that does not resolve to a single founding line. It carries what the pension file would not record and the census would not permit. The war made room for James Moore. What came after the war did not. The 20 names on this list are not the most famous names from the Revolution. They are the names that appear most consistently across the pension files, the bounty land warrants, and the militia rolls, the names that were common enough to be carried into every corner of the war and every settlement that followed it. If your surname is among them, the path back through the pension files is one of the most documented genealogical routes in American history. The pension testimony alone can place an ancestor in a specific county, a specific engagement, and a specific year with a precision that most colonial-era records cannot match. The bounty land warrant files that followed the pension system added land descriptions and sometimes family information that the pension process itself did not require. And the Y-chromosome can tell you whether the line you have traced on paper is the line your biology confirms, and where those two accounts diverge, the divergence is itself a piece of the record, pointing toward the family decision, the census misclassification, or the name adoption that the official history was not designed to acknowledge. The muster rolls are still there. The pension files are still there. The bounty land records and the county deed books and the church registers that survived the wars and fires and courthouse floods of the following 2 centuries are still there, and the surname projects that aggregate Y-chromosome results from thousands of men across dozens of names continue to add data every month. The haplogroup data from those projects grows more precise every year as more men submit their Y-chromosome tests and more matches appear across lines that the paper trail had not previously connected. An ancestor named Sullivan or Moore or Thompson or Davis, who signed a muster roll in 1776, left a record in at least 3 places: the military file, the land records that followed the war, and the genome of every male line descendant alive today. 2 of those records are in archives open to anyone who knows where to look. One of them is in U, written into the Y chromosome the same way a surname is written into a family Bible, passed from father to son across 2.5 centuries without alteration, waiting for the test that finally reads it back. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.